In a great hall with pillars hewn out of the living stone sat the Elven King on a chair of carven wood.
In the book, Thranduil is not fully drawn, so to speak, as a character. In fact, he's not actually named in The Hobbit, except to say that he is the Elven King.
Tolkien doesn't really describe anything more than he's the king of the woodland realm.
But, you know, in a film, you can't quite get away with some of the simplicity that you can in a book, especially a book written for younger people. It has to feel real. And that's one of the rules that we've always given ourselves with these films, is to have our characters have a degree of complexity.
Cate Blanchett and Hugo Weaving and Orlando Bloom created such iconic elves. And so here I had this new elf to play with, and I was thinking, what makes this very powerful king of elves different than them? She's an elf with dungeons. You know, there's a lot to that.
One of the screenwriter's strengths in this film is to actually remain faithful to what's in the book, but nevertheless add all those dimensions to characters like Thranduil.
As filmmakers, we take our clues from Tolkien, obviously. We take our guidance from the book.
The king's cave was his palace, and the strong place of his treasure, and the fortress of his people against their enemies.
Thranduil's underground kingdom in the forest is really an echo or a parallel to this elven king Thingol, who's featured in Tolkien's earlier stories. And Thingol lived in a hill underground in this amazing guarded realm called Menegroth.
For the Woodland Realm, we chose to take that a little bit further and create this king who is now literally in a state where his people are shut off from the outside world.
No one enters this kingdom, and no one leaves it.
If the Elf King had a weakness, it was for treasure, especially for silver and white gems.
And so that became an interesting idea. It was like, okay, where did this come from?
The Elven King, the character himself, is inspired by a character from Tolkien's earlier writings, King Thingol Greycloak.
Thingol, also like Thranduil, has his weaknesses, and one of them is passion for the jewels, and that was a kind of recurring theme in Tolkien's writing.
And we thought, okay, so maybe that's something that you can turn into a character story.
There are gems in the mountain that I too desire. White gems of pure starlight.
Because we needed to know why he would march upon that mountain without it feeling greedy. So what we decided was that these gems had a meaning for him.
The heirlooms of my people are not lightly forsaken.
In ancient days, they had had wars with some of the dwarves, whom they accused of stealing their treasure.
We've seen all of that in earlier writings that predate The Hobbit. King Thingol had a great quarrel with the dwarves, which is what Tolkien referred to in The Hobbit.
Thingol arranges for the dwarves to make a necklace for him, but then there is a dispute over payment and ownership.
Now, there's some real contention as to what exactly happened, but the dwarves actually went in and killed Thingol in his own halls.
In revenge, the elves go after the dwarves, and they wipe these guys out. So you can understand the intensity of the blood feud between these two races that persists for thousands of years afterwards.
We took that story thread about a dispute over jewels that Professor Tolkien in the Book of the Hobbit ascribes to past grievances and expanded on it. And it began to help us shape Thranduil.
The film did rather well in motivating Thranduil's refusal to help the dwarves when Smaug attacked. Help us! And the dwarves' deep resentment of the fact that he refused to help. Well, that's not in the book, but it is, I think, quite consistent with the way that Tolkien presents the elves in particular.
Tolkien clearly was inspired by his own construction of King Thingol living in the caves in the Great Forest. But we don't know whether the Elven King in The Hobbit was originally intended to be Thingol or a Thingol-like character. And it's not until he starts writing the sequel that he decides, no, this is a new character.
We find out his name in The Lord of the Rings when we meet his son, Legolas Greenleaf.
Maigovanen, Legolas Thranduilion.
Govannas Vingwenenle, Haldir Olorien.
One of the things that we got to do in The Hobbit is to bring in the character of Legolas. He's not actually in the book, but I think we would have probably been killed if we hadn't met Legolas in these movies.
Do not think I won't kill you, dwarf.
It's highly likely that Legolas was still living at home with his dad at the events of The Hobbit, and why not have him part of the story, taking advantage of the fact that we have now the full picture of Tolkien's family tree, as it were.
One of the things that was interesting for me about Legolas being a part of The Hobbit was for me to get to go back and create a backstory for Legolas, and particularly the father-son relationship. Why did you do that? You promised to set him free.
And I did.
Thranduil is really a very complex character, you know. He's an elf with an axe to grind, you know, which is normally a dwarf's job, right?
Stay here, if you will, and rot. 100 years is a mere blink in the life of an elf.
You get the sense when you meet Thranduil that his agendas are so obviously distinct and his superiority is so evident that there's something frightening, and that's a different quality that we haven't seen before in an elven leader.
Thranduil is nefarious, he's duplicitous, he's a commanding individual. All of these elements you would think inform a very clarifying view of a character. They don't. They just make it more and more complex to find that beautiful and refined piece of design that is going to perfectly represent that individual.
We explored all kinds of different ideas for Thranduil back in the days with Guillermo del Toro in the beginning. And one was an Orientalist kind of influence that was coming through in terms of headdresses, in terms of makeup, in terms of costuming.
Some of the ideas I was playing with, because we were sort of pushing this more Orientalist sort of idea, was he's obviously someone really quite stone cold, quite imposing and intimidating, that would have sort of a mantle that could have a slightly armoured feel to it, and a crown that was kind of sort of dangerous looking, quite spiny. We even started playing around with the idea of painting tattoos on their skin, like with the henna painting in some cultures where they paint pattern work onto themselves as a decorative device.
A lot of kooky ideas were cooked up early on because Guillermo inspires people to really go laterally and think broadly. Of course, when Pete came on board, it was important that every character in the movie now complemented his vision for his film, and that required us to revisit the elves. And have you got any thoughts of an actor that we could base them on? Not that you may have cast someone, but even someone that we could design around body type.
Casting elves is honestly a nightmare. I mean, there's no point casting an elf if he looks like he's 55 years old or 60 years old. But at the same time, you can't have an 18-year-old, beautiful, fresh-faced person playing a 1,000-year-old elf. I mean, elves are immortal. So that's always our problem. And we had seen Lee Pace in a movie called The Fall. He was really quite remarkable in that film. When it came to looking for Thranduil, we remembered Lee, and we met him in New York on a casting trip.
That week, I was so kind of excited to meet with them. I'm such a huge fan of the Lord of the Rings series that, you know, I kind of rewatched them all. I got the director's cut, watched that, watched all the documentaries, and kind of just put myself in Middle-earth.
How far did they travel?
Well, we tracked them as far as the Great Oak Clearing.
And there you killed them?
Yes, my lord.
You killed them all? You do not think to keep one of them alive?
It was dark. We were outnumbered.
I don't care if you were fighting alone in blind. I do not accept incompetence from a captain of my guard.
Lee had that gravity. He had a sense that he could be 1,000 years old, he could be immortal, but also that he had lived. He had lived a long life, he had seen a lot, and he had been through a lot. And that Lee really brought that feeling to the role.
Literal, my fighter, my golden-eyed assassin. You have skill and cunning. You could go far.
Thranduil, in my mind, started out as kind of the anti-Elrond. He doesn't sit and have conversations with wizards about the best possible course of action to benefit Middle-earth as a whole. He's just out for pursuing his own agenda. And so where Elrond is very simple and elegant in his costumery, with Thranduil we had the opportunity to actually go quite elaborate and fanciful.
Conceptually, you know, his look, it was really hard to get right. He is a king born and bred. Everything that was being drawn initially was trying to add that to him, when actually he doesn't need it.
There was kind of an aha moment when Philippa said, you know, you want to think about this guy as a rock star. Instead of buttoning him up, let's open his neckline and let's give him an arrogance, but also a kind of a self-assured cockiness.
And I kept going on and on and on about this, and it was like, you know, the really great designers, it's like the simplicity of a great suit. And I came across an image of Tom Ford.
Tom Ford is the American designer who turned Gucci around, and he just looks so cool, lounging out on a chair. And I mean lounging, I mean like really lounging, like hanging out on one side, legs off to the other.
And I was like, that's Thranduil.
In the next pieces of artwork that I did, I changed the way he was sitting on his throne in my pictures to sort of throwing himself around a little bit more. And that suddenly gave us a window into this character. And the costume design kind of took off from there.
Sometimes you design costumes before you know who the actor is. You might be designing for someone in your mind that's 6'4", and in walks someone 5'6". So anyway, with Lee, what you get is exactly what you want physically, because he's tall and handsome and he's got the best shoulders to hang a costume on.
God, that orange is just... Yeah.
The orange
bold.
looks phenomenal.
He's money, this elf king. I mean, it really is a fun character to dress up.
Amazing.
Working with Lee Pace was wonderful because he definitely wears clothes incredibly well. He's got a great presence, and he also moves incredibly well, all adding to that movement of the King of the Elves.
The source comes from here. Yes! That's the power.
Thranduil really had this burning, threatening presence, but he really had to just rein everything in. So it was like this tornado that he was pulling back from just unleashing.
Why do I see myself going?
Elven movement training that we've done with Terry has kind of given me my entire character. It's not even about movement as much as it is about thought. Kind of like as the wind and the ocean pulls and pushes, it's like that's how they move through space.
You're riding these waves. It's like you're surfing. It's like you're surfing through space and you get to go, whoa, here's another wave.
Yeah. Terry was great. When I got back to The Hobbit, it had been 10, 12 years. He brought me back to my inner elf.
When Orlando first came in Lord of the Rings, I mean, he's the elf that we all know. We didn't have a movements coach like Terry. So Orlando, being the first elf, he had to create an elvish trademark.
There was a sort of cat-like grace and presence, agility, constantly aware. All of those things that basically gave me the sense of being an immortal being. After 10 years of living my life, coming back to that kind of centered place of Legolas was really actually kind of wonderful.
On the breath, feel it come from your center.
The way Terry kind of cracked into this elven movement is that it's not just kind of a Zen peacefulness, it's like a relaxed engagement.
Let it be like a piss shiver that it almost lifts you up. Yeah. Okay?
Piss shiver. I don't even know what a piss shiver is.
All right, guys. We're gonna do some of the hardest shit there is. All right, see how when you get out of your head, when you get out of the zone, it's shit?
Yeah, see that?
It's all about...
It's the piss shiver.
It's killing us.
When Orlando and Lee worked together, it was really helpful because it's a father-son relationship, and it was just nice to have them connect in a very private space before they get on set, because then they have that history.